Elena, your recipes are good, but let's be honest, mine are what made Stella Rosa famous, my business partner Marco Rossi said during the interview with San Francisco magazine. The food critic sitting across from us at our restaurant's best table nodded, scribbling notes as Marco continued his performance. Elena handles the day-to-day cooking, which is valuable, but the creative vision, the signature dishes that put us on the map, those came from my family's traditions and my culinary innovation. I sat next to him in the dining room we'd built together 3 years ago, smiling as he took credit for every dish I'd created, every recipe I'd developed, every innovation that had earned Stella Rosa its Michelin star and reputation as one of San Francisco's best Italian restaurants. The food critic looked at me expectantly, waiting for my response to Marco's characterization of our partnership. You're absolutely right, Marco, I said, keeping my voice warm and supportive. Your vision for Stella Rosa made us successful. I'm lucky to execute your creative ideas. Marco beamed, satisfied that I'd confirmed his narrative for the magazine profile. The critic smiled, clearly buying the story of Marco as creative genius and me as talented but secondary execution chef. They had no idea they were documenting the biggest lie in San Francisco's culinary scene. What Marco didn't know, what the food critic couldn't imagine as she wrote her article positioning Marco as Stella Rosa's true talent, was that every signature dish Marco claimed as his creation was actually mine. The handmade pasta with black truffle and Meyer lemon that had been featured in Bon Appetit was my recipe. The deconstructed tiramisu that food bloggers obsessed over was my innovation. The wood-fired branzino with blood orange and fennel that critics called, quote, revelatory, end quote, came from my notebooks. What Marco also didn't know was that I'd been documenting his theft for 6 months. Recipe notebooks with dated entries proving I'd created dishes before he claimed them. Text messages where I'd shared ideas that later appeared as, quote, Marco's signature creations, end quote. Witnesses who'd seen me developing dishes in our test kitchen. And a comprehensive plan to leave Stella Rosa, open my own restaurant, and destroy Marco's reputation so completely that he'd never recover. In exactly 90 days, Marco would discover that the partner he'd been exploiting for 3 years wasn't the grateful subordinate he'd assumed. She was a chef who'd been strategically preparing to take everything he thought he'd built and reveal him as a fraud who'd built his reputation on stolen recipes and lies. Before we dive into how a chef whose work was systematically stolen by her business partner destroyed his career while building her own culinary empire, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes creative theft deserves the same consequences as any other stealing, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply revealing the truth about who actually created the work. If you've had your creative work stolen, if you've watched someone else take credit for your ideas, if you've been the invisible talent behind someone else's success, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and patience prove more powerful than charm and public recognition. Now let's step into the world of a restaurant partnership where one person created everything and the other person claimed credit, where culinary talent was exploited for years, and where the truth eventually destroyed the exploiter while liberating the real creative genius. My name is Elena Marino, and I'm a 32-year-old chef from a working-class Italian-American family in New Jersey. My grandmother Nonna Rosa taught me to cook in her tiny kitchen in Newark, passing down recipes and techniques that had traveled from Sicily to America in her mother's memory. Cooking wasn't just about food in our family. It was about love, tradition, and the alchemy of transforming simple ingredients into something that brought people together. Nonna Rosa could make magic with flour, water, and eggs, creating pasta that seemed to embody the soul of Sicily. She taught me that cooking was both art and discipline, requiring creativity within the structure of tradition. I worked in my uncle's pizzeria through high school, then attended the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York. I graduated near the top of my class and moved to San Francisco to work in the city's vibrant restaurant scene. I spent 5 years working my way up through some of the Bay Area's best kitchens, learning from talented chefs and developing my own style that honored Italian traditions while incorporating California's seasonal ingredients and innovative techniques. By the time I was 29, I was sous chef at a respected Italian restaurant in the Mission District, earning good money and professional recognition. But I wanted more. I wanted my own place where I could create freely, where I could develop a menu that reflected my vision of modern Italian cuisine rooted in traditional techniques. That's when I met Marco Rossi at an industry event. He was 35, charming and confident, from a wealthy San Francisco family with connections throughout the city's restaurant and hospitality industry. Marco had worked briefly in his family's import business but had always dreamed of opening a restaurant. He had access to capital through family money and connections to investors, real estate, and food media. What he didn't have was culinary talent or any real understanding of how to run a professional kitchen. Marco's proposition was straightforward. He'd provide the capital, location, and business connections to open a high-end Italian restaurant. I'd provide the culinary expertise, develop the menu, and run the kitchen. We'd be equal partners, 50-50 ownership, sharing both the work and the rewards of building something successful. It sounded perfect. I had talent but no capital. Marco had money but no cooking ability. Together we could build the restaurant I'd been dreaming about. I was naive enough to believe that equal partnership on paper would translate to equal recognition and respect in reality. We opened Stella Rosa in a beautiful space in Russian Hill that Marco's family connections helped us secure. The build-out was expensive but stunning, with an open kitchen, intimate dining room, and sophisticated design that attracted San Francisco's food-obsessed clientele from day one. Marco handled front of house, schmoozing with customers and critics, while I ran the kitchen and created the menu that would make our reputation. The first year was intense. 14-hour days developing recipes, training line cooks, perfecting every dish until it met my standards. I created a menu that respected Italian culinary traditions while incorporating the seasonal California ingredients that made Bay Area cuisine special. Handmade pastas with locally sourced vegetables. Seafood from Half Moon Bay prepared with Italian techniques. Desserts that deconstructed classic Italian sweets into modern presentations. The food was exceptional, and critics noticed immediately. Within 6 months, we were getting rave reviews in local publications. Within a year, Bon Appetit featured us in a piece about the new generation of Italian restaurants. Within 18 months, we earned a Michelin star, an achievement that very few restaurants accomplish so quickly. Throughout this success, Marco positioned himself as Stella Rosa's creative force. In interviews, he'd talk about, quote, his recipes, end quote, and, quote, his culinary vision, end quote. He'd describe dishes I'd created as if he'd developed them himself, sharing stories about inspiration and technique that were complete fabrications. Food writers ate it up because Marco was charismatic, well-connected, and fit their narrative of the visionary chef-entrepreneur better than I did as the quiet woman actually cooking the food. Initially, I didn't mind the misattribution too much. We were partners, the restaurant was succeeding, and I told myself that Marco's PR skills were valuable even if the truth about who created what was being obscured. I was making good money, cooking at a high level, and building a restaurant I was proud of. The credit imbalance seemed like an acceptable trade-off for the opportunity. But the theft escalated. Marco started claiming not just general creative direction but specific dishes as his personal creations. A food writer would ask about the black truffle pasta's development, and Marco would spin an elaborate story about inspiration from his childhood in Italy, even though he'd grown up in Pacific Heights and the dish came from my experiments with local truffles and Meyer lemons. Critics would praise the innovative tiramisu, and Marco would explain his deconstructionist philosophy and technique, never mentioning that I'd spent weeks perfecting the recipe or that the idea came from my desire to honor tradition while embracing modern presentation. Customers would ask about the branzino preparation, and Marco would describe his family's fishing traditions and his grandmother's recipes, Complete fabrications given that the dish combined my Nonna Rosa's techniques with California ingredients I'd discovered at the farmer's market. Every signature dish, every menu innovation, every technique that made Stella Rosa special was attributed to Marco while I was positioned as the skilled technician who executed his creative vision. The narrative was reinforced through repeated media coverage, customer interactions, and industry events where Marco represented the restaurant as its creative genius. I started to push back gently, trying to correct the record when opportunities arose. In interviews where I was present, I'd mention that I'd developed specific dishes or techniques. But Marco was skilled at redirecting credit in ways that seemed collegial rather than competitive. "Well, Elena perfected the execution of course," he'd say smoothly, but the core concept came from our collaborative process, meaning he'd make vague suggestions and I'd create the actual dishes. The professional cost of this dynamic became clear when I was passed over for recognition that should have been mine. A James Beard nomination for Best Chef went to Marco, even though I did all the actual cooking. Food magazine features focused on Marco's story and vision with me barely mentioned. Industry peers congratulated Marco on Stella Rosa's Michelin star without realizing he couldn't cook most of the dishes that earned it. But the emotional cost was even more significant. I felt invisible despite creating everything that made Stella Rosa successful. I felt undervalued as my work was consistently attributed to someone else. I felt trapped because speaking out more forcefully might damage the restaurant or make me seem jealous or difficult. The breaking point came during that San Francisco magazine interview. Hearing Marco tell the critic that my recipes were, quote, "good but not what made us famous," end quote, while claiming my signature dishes as his own creations, crystallized something that had been building for months. I was done being invisible. I was done letting Marco steal credit for my work. And I was done protecting a partnership that was really just exploitation disguised as collaboration. I smiled and agreed with Marco during that interview because I'd already made my decision. I would leave Stella Rosa, open my own restaurant, and expose Marco as a fraud who'd built his reputation on stolen recipes. But I wouldn't do it impulsively or emotionally. I'd do it strategically and comprehensively, with documentation so thorough that Marco's reputation would be destroyed while mine was established as the real talent behind Stella Rosa's success. Over the next 3 months, I systematically prepared my departure and Marco's destruction. I gathered evidence proving I'd created every dish he'd claimed. Recipe notebooks with dated entries showing my development process. Photographs timestamped before Marco had claimed dishes as his creations. Text messages and emails where I'd shared ideas and techniques that later appeared as, quote, "Marco's innovations," end quote. Testimony from line cooks and sous chefs who'd watched me create dishes that Marco later claimed credit for. I also started developing my exit strategy. I couldn't just leave Stella Rosa without a plan because Marco controlled the physical space and business structure. I needed my own restaurant where I could showcase my actual talent and prove that Stella Rosa's success came from my cooking, not Marco's supposed vision. I found a location in the Mission District, a smaller space than Stella Rosa but with character and the right neighborhood energy. I negotiated a lease quietly, using my savings and a small loan from my uncle to cover deposits and initial build-out costs. I began planning a menu that would be unmistakably mine, dishes that built on what I'd created at Stella Rosa but evolved in ways that demonstrated my continued innovation. Most importantly, I reached out to food writers, critics, and industry contacts who knew the truth about who actually cooked at Stella Rosa. Many had suspected the credit attribution was wrong but hadn't questioned it publicly because Marco was charming and well-connected. I provided them with documentation showing the real creative process behind dishes they'd praised, and I invited them to cover the opening of my new restaurant where they'd see me cooking without Marco taking credit. The response was enthusiastic. Food writers love an underdog story, and a female chef who'd been having her work stolen by a male business partner fit a narrative they were eager to tell. Critics who'd praised Stella Rosa were interested in seeing whether the quality would follow me or stay with Marco. Industry insiders who'd known the truth for years were ready to support me once I was willing to go public. I recruited key staff from Stella Rosa, offering them positions at my new restaurant and better compensation than Marco was paying. My sous chef, a talented young woman named Lisa Chen who'd trained under me for 2 years, was the first to commit. 3 experienced line cooks followed, recognizing that following me meant learning from the actual creative force behind Stella Rosa's food. When everything was in place, I gave Marco my 30 days notice. I told him I was leaving to open my own place, framing it as wanting the opportunity to be head chef and owner rather than a partner in someone else's vision. Marco was surprisingly gracious, saying he understood my ambition and wishing me well. He clearly didn't see me as a threat because he believed Stella Rosa's success was due to his vision and connections rather than my cooking. "You'll do well with your own place," Marco said confidently during our final conversation as partners. "You're a talented cook, Elena. But running a successful restaurant requires more than just good food. It requires vision, business sense, and industry relationships. Those are things I brought to Stella Rosa that made us special. I hope you find success, but I think you'll discover how valuable my contributions were once you're doing this on your own." I smiled and thanked him for the opportunity to learn from our partnership. I didn't mention that I'd been documenting his theft for months or that I'd already lined up press coverage that would expose him. I didn't mention that I'd recruited his best kitchen staff or that food critics were planning to visit both restaurants to compare quality. I just left gracefully, counting down the days until my new restaurant opened and the truth about who'd actually created Stella Rosa's food became undeniable. Marino's opened in the Mission District exactly 90 days after I left Stella Rosa. The space was intimate, seating only 40 compared to Stella Rosa's 80, but it had warmth and authenticity that our Russian Hill location lacked. The open kitchen let diners watch me cook, making it impossible for anyone to claim the food came from somewhere other than my hands. The menu showcased my style clearly, building on techniques I'd developed at Stella Rosa while evolving into something distinctly mine. Opening night was attended by every food writer and critic who'd covered Stella Rosa over the past 3 years. They wanted to see whether the quality would follow me or stay with Marco, whether Stella Rosa's success had been my cooking or his supposed vision. I'd invited them specifically to witness the truth, and I'd prepared a tasting menu that would demonstrate my continued innovation and skill. The meal I served that night was some of the best cooking I'd ever done. Handmade pasta with local nettles and brown butter sage that evolved my Stella Rosa technique into something more delicate and refined. Slow-roasted pork shoulder with quince mostarda that honored Italian tradition while incorporating California ingredients. A deconstructed panna cotta with blood orange and olive oil that built on my tiramisu innovation but pushed into new territory. Every dish made clear that I was the talent behind Stella Rosa's food and that I'd continued to evolve and improve. Critics took notes, photographed dishes, and asked detailed questions about my techniques and inspirations that I could answer genuinely because these were actually my creations rather than stolen credit for someone else's work. The reviews started appearing within a week and they were devastating for Marco while establishing me as the real culinary force. The San Francisco Chronicle's review was titled, "Elena Marino's new restaurant proves she was the real talent behind Stella Rosa." The review detailed how dishes at Marino's echoed and exceeded the quality of Stella Rosa's best work, making clear that the creative vision had followed me rather than staying with Marco. Bon Appetit sent a writer who'd previously covered Stella Rosa, and her piece was even more direct. She'd compared the menus, talked to former staff, reviewed my documentation of recipe development, and concluded that Marco had been taking credit for my work for 3 years. The article was titled, "The Chef Who Cooked in Someone Else's Shadow: How Elena Marino Built Stella Rosa's Reputation While Marco Rossi Claimed Credit." The piece went viral in food media circles. Other publications picked up the story, examining the pattern of male chef owners taking credit for female chefs' work. Industry conversations erupted about how many supposedly innovative restaurants were really talented women cooking while charismatic men claimed credit. Marco and Stella Rosa became symbols of a systemic problem in culinary culture. Marco tried to defend himself initially through his own interviews and social media posts. He claimed the coverage was unfair, that he and I had truly collaborated and the division of credit had been mutually agreed upon, that he'd contributed creative direction even if I'd executed the specific recipes. But his defenses crumbled against my documentation and the testimony of staff who'd watched him claim my work for years. Food critics who'd previously praised Marco started questioning whether they'd been complicit in perpetuating his theft through their coverage. Some issued corrections to previous articles, noting that they'd misattributed creative credit and apologizing for not questioning Marco's claims more carefully. Others wrote follow-up pieces examining how they'd been charmed by Marco's presentation while overlooking that he couldn't actually cook the dishes he described creating. The San Francisco Magazine writer who'd interviewed us 3 months earlier published a mea culpa about how she'd accepted Marco's narrative without verification and contributed to erasing my contributions. She'd gone back to Stella Rosa and asked Marco to cook the dishes he'd claimed inventing during their interview. He'd fumbled badly, unable to execute techniques he'd described in detail, making clear he'd been reciting my process rather than describing his own work. The impact on both restaurants was immediate and dramatic. Reservations at Marino's became impossible to secure, with a waiting list extending months into the future. Food media coverage drove demand beyond what my small space could accommodate. I was cooking for a full dining room every night and turning away disappointed customers who couldn't get reservations. Meanwhile, Stella Rosa's reservations declined precipitously as the truth about Marco's theft became widely known. Customers who'd enjoyed the food there questioned whether quality would remain without me in the kitchen. Food media coverage that had once been laudatory became critical, questioning whether Marco could maintain standards or whether Stella Rosa had been entirely dependent on my cooking. Marco hired new chefs to replace me and the staff I'd recruited, but they couldn't replicate the dishes that had made Stella Rosa famous because those dishes were mine and Marco couldn't teach techniques he'd never actually understood. The quality declined noticeably. Critics who'd praised Stella Rosa during my tenure published negative reviews after my departure, making the connection between my exit and the quality drop explicit. Within 60 days of my departure, Stella Rosa had lost its Michelin star. The review noted that signature dishes were no longer consistent, that the creative spark that had made the restaurant special was absent, and that the food seemed like poor imitations of what they'd previously served. The loss was humiliating for Marco and proved conclusively that I'd been the source of Stella Rosa's culinary quality. 90 days after I'd left, exactly the timeline I'd predicted when I started planning my departure, Stella Rosa closed permanently. Marco claimed he was, quote, pursuing other opportunities and refocusing his creative energy, end quote, but the reality was that his restaurant had failed spectacularly once the actual talent behind its success was gone. His reputation was destroyed, his investors had lost confidence, and his supposed culinary vision was revealed as stolen credit for someone else's work. I watched this destruction with complicated feelings. Part of me felt satisfaction seeing Marco face consequences for years of theft. Part of me felt vindicated that the truth was finally recognized publicly. But part of me also felt tired from the months of strategic planning and the energy it had taken to expose what should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. The success of Marino's exceeded my most optimistic projections. Within 6 months, we'd earned our own Michelin star, an achievement that typically takes years but that critics acknowledged was based on established excellence rather than emerging talent. I was nominated for a James Beard Award for Best Chef, West, the recognition that should have been mine years earlier. And I was featured in national food media as an example of a female chef stepping out of an exploitative partnership to claim her own success. The publicity attracted investors interested in helping me expand. I opened a second location in Oakland 18 months after the original Marino's, this one larger and with a slightly different concept that let me explore regional Italian cooking more deeply. Both restaurants maintained waiting lists, earned critical acclaim, and became destinations for serious food lovers visiting the Bay Area. My success wasn't just about revenge against Marco, though exposing his theft was satisfying. It was about proving to myself and the culinary world that I was the real talent, that I could succeed independently without someone stealing credit for my work, and that my cooking was good enough to sustain a restaurant on its own merits. The experience also radicalized me about issues of credit and recognition in professional kitchens. I'd experienced firsthand how a charming man with connections could steal a woman's creative work and build a reputation on her talent. I'd watched food media uncritically accept his claims without questioning whether the person doing the talking was the person doing the cooking. This awareness made me intentional about creating equitable working environments in my own restaurants. My kitchen staff, majority women and people from diverse backgrounds, received clear credit for their contributions. If a line cook developed a new technique or dish component, that was acknowledged publicly rather than absorbed into quote, chef's vision, end quote. When food media covered Marino's, I insisted on naming and crediting my whole team rather than accepting sole credit. I also became active in industry conversations about recognition and equity. I spoke at culinary conferences about my experience having my work stolen and how the industry could do better at ensuring actual creators received credit. I mentored young female chefs, particularly those working as sous chefs or in partnership situations where credit imbalances might develop. Through this advocacy work, I connected with other chefs who'd had similar experiences of their work being stolen or minimized. Women who'd created signature dishes that male executive chefs claimed as their own. Chefs of color whose innovations were absorbed into quote, new American cuisine, end quote, without acknowledgement. Pastry chefs whose desserts made restaurants famous while the savory chefs received all the recognition. These conversations revealed that my experience with Marco wasn't unusual or exceptional. It was a common pattern in professional kitchens where structural inequities meant that creative work flowed upward to whoever had the platform and connections to claim it publicly. The difference was that I'd had the resources, documentation, and determination to expose the theft and build my own success despite it. 3 years after leaving Stella Rosa, I'm 35 years old and running 2 successful restaurants with a third in development. I've won the James Beard Award Marco had been nominated for. I've published a cookbook that credits my Nonna Rosa and the culinary traditions I learned from her alongside my own innovations. And I've built a reputation as both a talented chef and an advocate for equity and proper recognition in professional kitchens. Marco, meanwhile, has largely disappeared from San Francisco's culinary scene. He attempted to open a new restaurant about 18 months after Stella Rosa closed, but it failed within 6 months when it became clear he had no culinary talent to offer without someone to steal from. His reputation was so damaged that investors wouldn't back future ventures, and industry connections that had once seemed valuable had become toxic associations no one wanted. The last I heard, Marco had left San Francisco entirely, reportedly working in his family's import business and no longer attempting to present himself as a chef or restaurateur. His name, once associated with Stella Rosa's success, was now primarily remembered as an example of credit theft and the exploitation of actual culinary talent. I occasionally think about what might have happened if I'd stayed at Stella Rosa and continued letting Marco claim credit for my work. Would the restaurant have remained successful? Would I have eventually earned recognition? Or would I have spent decades being invisible while building someone else's reputation? I'll never know because I chose differently. I chose to document the theft, plan my departure strategically, and expose the truth in ways that destroyed Marco's reputation while establishing mine. That choice cost me the partnership and the restaurant I'd helped build, but it gave me ownership of my own work, recognition for my actual contributions, and the freedom to build something entirely mine. The satisfaction of that choice deepens every time I walk into Marino's and see a dining room full of people eating food I created, that I receive proper credit for, that builds my reputation rather than someone else's. Every time food media covers my restaurants and accurately attributes dishes and techniques to me. Every time a young chef tells me that my story inspired them to insist on proper credit for their work. Marco thought he could build a career on my talent because I was quiet and focused on cooking rather than self-promotion. He assumed I'd accept secondary recognition because that's what women in professional kitchens are conditioned to accept. He believed his connections and charm were more valuable than my actual culinary skill. He was catastrophically wrong. The chef he'd been exploiting for 3 years turned out to be the real talent behind Stella Rosa's success, capable of building her own reputation once she stopped letting him steal credit. The woman he'd positioned as a skilled technician executing his vision proved to be the actual creative genius whose work had made his reputation. The quiet chef who'd smiled and agreed while he claimed her recipes became the successful restaurateur with multiple acclaimed locations and national recognition. And the charming partner who'd built his reputation on stolen work became an industry cautionary tale about what happens when you underestimate the person actually creating everything you claim to have invented. That's justice in the culinary world. That's what happens when documentation meets determination and truth eventually overcomes charm. Marco Rossi spent 3 years building a reputation on stolen recipes. I spent 90 days destroying that reputation while building my own empire on the work that had always been mine. The chef who'd cooked in someone else's shadow stepped fully into the light. And the fraud who'd claimed credit for her work disappeared into the obscurity he'd always deserved. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic or violent. It's simply revealing the truth and letting it destroy the lies people built their success upon. Hit subscribe if this story resonated with you. Share it with someone who's had their creative work stolen. And remember that if you're the actual talent, eventually truth wins. It just requires documentation, patience, and the courage to step out of someone else's shadow even when it means risking the security of an established position. Marco thought I needed him to succeed. Instead, I proved he'd needed me all along. That's the sweetest revenge any stolen from creator can achieve. The months following Stella Rosa's closure and Marino's explosive success were transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd expected professional vindication and financial reward, and both of those came. What I hadn't expected was how completely the experience would change my understanding of the restaurant industry, my role in it, and my responsibility to use my platform for systemic change. The media coverage of my story attracted attention from far beyond San Francisco's food scene. National publications picked up the narrative of a talented female chef finally getting recognition after years of having her work stolen by a male partner. The story resonated because it wasn't just about me and Marco. It was about a pattern that existed throughout the culinary world where women cooked brilliantly while men claimed credit and built celebrity. I received hundreds of messages from other chefs, mostly women but also men from marginalized backgrounds, sharing similar experiences. Sous chefs who created signature dishes that executive chefs claimed as their own. Pastry chefs whose desserts made restaurants famous while they remained anonymous in the kitchen. Line cooks whose techniques and innovations were absorbed into the chef's vision, without acknowledgement or compensation. Each story had unique details but familiar patterns. Someone with talent and creativity working for someone with platform and connections. Ideas flowing from the talented creator to the connected claimer. Credit and recognition going to whoever controlled the media relationships and public narrative rather than to whoever actually created the work. Reading these messages was both validating and enraging. Validating because they confirmed my experience wasn't unique or exceptional, that the theft I'd experienced was part of systemic problems in how culinary work was recognized and rewarded. Enraging because the sheer number of similar stories made clear how widespread the problem was and how many talented people were being exploited. I started responding to these messages, offering advice based on my own experience. Document everything. Keep dated recipe notebooks proving when you created dishes. Screenshot text messages and emails where you share ideas. Identify witnesses who can testify about your creative process. Build comprehensive evidence before confronting or leaving because without documentation it becomes your word against someone more powerful. These individual consultations evolved into something more structured. I developed a workshop for culinary professionals about protecting your creative work and ensuring you receive proper credit. The workshop covered practical strategies for documentation, legal frameworks for intellectual property in culinary contexts, and case studies including my own experience with Marco. The workshops were held at culinary schools, professional organizations, and industry conferences. The attendance was always strong, mostly young chefs early in their careers who wanted to avoid the exploitation I'd experienced. But also established chefs who'd been having their work stolen for years and didn't know how to address it without destroying their careers. The most common question was always some variation of, how do I insist on credit without seeming difficult or ungrateful? It was the question I'd struggled with for years at Stella Rosa, the impossible balance between advocating for yourself and maintaining relationships with people who had power over your career. My answer was always honest. Sometimes you can't maintain the relationship while also insisting on proper credit because the relationship is built on your willingness to accept exploitation. Sometimes getting the recognition you deserve requires leaving the exploitative situation and building your own platform. Sometimes the cost of proper credit is losing the security of an established position. These weren't comfortable answers. People wanted strategies for reforming exploitative partnerships from within, for gently correcting credit imbalances without confrontation. And sometimes those strategies worked, particularly when the credit theft was unintentional rather than deliberate. But in cases like mine with Marco, where the theft was systematic and intentional, gentle strategies were insufficient. The workshops also addressed the structural factors that enabled credit theft in professional kitchens. The way food media focused on charismatic personalities rather than investigating who actually created dishes. The assumption that executive chefs or restaurant owners were responsible for everything innovative rather than crediting the broader team. The tendency to lionize individual genius rather than recognizing collaborative creative processes. These structural issues meant that even well-intentioned people could perpetuate credit theft by accepting surface narratives without questioning them. The food critic who'd interviewed Marco and me at Stella Rosa hadn't been malicious. She'd simply accepted Marco's claims without verification because he was confident and articulate and fit her expectations about who creates innovative cuisine. Changing these structural patterns required changing how food media operated, how culinary education prepared chefs to navigate credit and recognition, and how the industry valued documentation and verification over charisma and connections. It was ambitious work that would take years or decades, but it felt necessary after experiencing firsthand how easily talent could be exploited. My involvement in this advocacy work led to an invitation to testify before a congressional committee examining workplace equity and intellectual property protection. The hearing focused on creative industries including music, writing, and culinary arts where work was often stolen or uncredited. I testified about my experience with Marco and the broader patterns I'd identified through my workshops and consultations with other chefs. The testimony was covered extensively in food media and sparked broader conversations about credit attribution in restaurants. Some established chefs pushed back, arguing that executive chefs deserved credit for restaurants' overall vision even if individual dishes came from sous chefs or line cooks. Others acknowledged the problem and committed to better attribution practices in their own kitchens and media coverage. The James Beard Foundation, influential in setting industry standards, announced new guidelines for award nominations requiring clearer attribution of who actually created nominated dishes and techniques. The guidelines weren't perfect and enforcement was voluntary, but they represented acknowledgement from a major industry institution that credit theft was a real problem requiring structural solutions. My restaurants became laboratories for implementing equitable recognition practices. When food media visited Marino's, I insisted on introducing my whole kitchen team rather than accepting sole credit. When dishes were featured in magazines, I made sure sous chefs and line cooks who'd contributed were named. When techniques were described, I credited the people who'd actually developed them. This approach was unusual enough that it became part of Marino's brand identity. We were known not just for excellent food but for being a restaurant that valued and recognized the whole team's contributions. This reputation helped with recruiting and retention, as talented cooks wanted to work in an environment where their creativity would be acknowledged rather than absorbed into the executive chef's celebrity. The financial success of both Marino's locations gave me resources to support other chefs fighting credit theft. I provided pro bono consulting to chefs documenting exploitation. I connected people with attorneys who understood culinary intellectual property. I offered financial support to chefs leaving exploitative partnerships who needed capital to open their own places. One particularly rewarding case involved a pastry chef named Maya Rodriguez who'd been working for a celebrity chef in Los Angeles. Maya had created the dessert program that was central to her restaurant's acclaim, but the celebrity chef claimed all the credit and paid Maya a standard pastry chef salary without acknowledgement or profit sharing. Maya had been documenting the situation for a year when she reached out to me for advice. I helped Maya develop her exit strategy, connected her with investors interested in supporting a standalone dessert-focused restaurant, and provided media introductions to critics who'd be interested in covering her story. When Maya opened her own place 6 months later, the coverage explicitly connected her new work to the acclaimed desserts she'd created at her previous position, making the credit theft obvious. Maya's former employer tried to maintain the dessert program without her but failed spectacularly. The quality declined immediately, critics noticed and noted the connection to Maya's departure, and within a year the restaurant had closed. Meanwhile, Maya's dessert restaurant became one of Law's hottest reservations and she received the recognition she'd deserved all along. Watching Maya's success felt like extending my own victory over Marco. Each chef who successfully escaped exploitation and built their own recognition was proof that the system could change, that documentation and strategic departure could overcome structural inequities. But not every story had a happy ending. I also heard from chefs who'd tried to expose credit theft and been destroyed professionally. Blacklisted from the industry by powerful chefs who portrayed them as disloyal or difficult. Unable to secure financing because investors believed the exploitative chef's version of events. Forced to leave the culinary world entirely because fighting back had made them unemployable. These failures were sobering reminders that my success wasn't just about talent and documentation. It was also about timing, luck, and the specific dynamics of my situation with Marco. I'd had enough resources to leave and open my own place. I'd had documentation comprehensive enough to prove my case convincingly. I'd had media relationships willing to take my side of the story seriously. Not everyone facing similar exploitation had these advantages. This awareness made me cautious about presenting my story as a universal blueprint for fighting credit theft. What worked for me might not work for someone with less financial security, less comprehensive documentation, or less media savvy. The structural problems that enabled exploitation in the first place were bigger than individual solutions, requiring industry-wide changes in how credit was attributed and how talent was recognized. My relationship with food media evolved significantly after Marino's success. Initially, I'd been grateful for any coverage that acknowledged my talent and corrected the record about Stella Rosa. But as I became more established and my restaurants received consistent acclaim, I became more demanding about how coverage was framed and who received credit. I pushed back when writers wanted to focus on my personal story of overcoming exploitation rather than my actual cooking in restaurants. I corrected interviewers who implied I'd somehow been complicit in Marco's theft by not speaking out sooner. I insisted on coverage that acknowledged systemic problems rather than framing my experience as purely individual triumph. Some food writers appreciated this pushback and produced more thoughtful coverage that examined broader industry patterns. Others were frustrated by what they saw as my unwillingness to provide the narrative they wanted. A few wrote that I'd become difficult or prickly, criticism I recognized as code for a woman who wouldn't perform gratitude for basic recognition. I'd learned from the Marco situation that controlling my own narrative was crucial. I couldn't prevent all misrepresentation, but I could refuse to participate in stories that distorted the truth or failed to acknowledge systemic factors. This sometimes meant turning down coverage opportunities, but I'd rather be accurately represented in fewer outlets than widely misrepresented in more. The third Marino's location, which opened in Napa Valley 3 years after the original, was conceived as more than just a restaurant. It included a culinary incubator program supporting young chefs, particularly women and people from underrepresented backgrounds, in developing their own concepts and businesses. The program provided commercial kitchen space, mentorship, business development support, and connections to investors and media. The incubator was my way of institutionalizing the informal support I'd been providing to individual chefs. Rather than case-by-case consulting, I created a structured program that could serve multiple people simultaneously and build a network of chefs supporting each other rather than competing. The first cohort of the incubator program included 6 chefs developing diverse concepts, from a Vietnamese bakery to a plant-based Italian restaurant to a fine dining tasting menu focused on indigenous ingredients. I worked with each chef on their specific needs, sharing lessons from my own experience while respecting that their situations and goals were different from mine. Watching these chefs develop their concepts and prepare for launch reminded me of my own journey from Stella Rosa to Marino's. The excitement mixed with terror. The confidence in your talent combined with uncertainty about business viability. The hope that your work would finally receive the recognition it deserved balanced against fear that you'd fail publicly. All 6 chefs from the first cohort successfully launched their restaurants within 18 months. Not all of them achieved the immediate success Marino's had experienced, but all of them created sustainable businesses showcasing their actual talent rather than building someone else's reputation. That felt like meaningful success regardless of critic acclaim or media attention. The incubator attracted attention from other established chefs interested in creating similar programs. I consulted with several restaurants and culinary organizations about developing their own versions, sharing our model and lessons learned. The more programs that existed supporting emerging chefs and protecting them from exploitation, the harder it would be for people like Marco to build careers on stolen work. My personal life also transformed during these years of professional success and advocacy work. I'd been so consumed by cooking and career that I'd barely dated during my 20s. The years at Stella Rosa were especially isolating as I worked 14-hour days while Marco claimed credit for my efforts. After opening Marino's and achieving financial security, I had more time and energy for relationships. I dated casually at first, meeting people through mutual friends and industry connections. Eventually I met David Chen, a sommelier who worked at a respected wine bar in Oakland. David understood restaurant culture and respected my work without being intimidated by my success. Our relationship developed slowly around shared meals, wine tastings, and conversations about food and culture. David had his own career and reputation separate from mine, which meant our dynamic was genuinely equal rather than me being positioned as the successful one and him as my partner. We talked about opening a wine bar together eventually, combining my food and his wine expertise in a collaborative project that would credit both of us appropriately. Marriage and family were possibilities we discussed without urgency. I was 35 and aware of biological clocks, but I also knew rushing into major life decisions because of societal pressure was a mistake. If we decided to have children, we would. If we didn't, we'd build a different kind of life together. Either way, the relationship was based on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than the exploitative dynamic I'd experienced with Marco. 5 years after leaving Stella Rosa, I was running 3 successful restaurants, a culinary incubator program, and an active advocacy practice around credit attribution and equity in professional kitchens. I'd won the James Beard Award, published a cookbook, and established a reputation as both a talented chef and an industry leader on equity issues. More satisfying than any of these achievements was the knowledge that I'd transformed my own exploitation into systemic change that would protect future generations of chefs. The workshops, the incubator, the media advocacy, the support for individual chefs fighting credit theft, all of it grew from my experience with Marco but extended far beyond personal revenge into meaningful structural reform. Marco's trajectory over those same 5 years was the opposite of mine. After Stella Rosa closed and his attempt at a new restaurant failed, he'd left San Francisco and the restaurant industry entirely. The last I heard, he was working in his family's import business and no longer attempting to present himself as a culinary expert. His name was occasionally mentioned in discussions about credit theft as a cautionary example, but otherwise he'd faded into obscurity. The contrast between our paths was stark. The chef who'd actually created everything built a culinary empire and became an industry leader. The fraud who'd claimed credit for her work lost everything and disappeared. The woman who'd been invisible for years became one of the most recognized and respected voices in American dining. The man who'd built his reputation on theft became a footnote in discussions about exploitation. This reversal felt like justice, but not the dramatic confrontational justice of some revenge stories. It was the quiet inexorable justice of truth eventually prevailing over lies, of talent ultimately being recognized over charisma, of systematic documentation defeating comfortable narratives. If I'd confronted Marco dramatically during our partnership or immediately after leaving Stella Rosa, he might have successfully portrayed me as bitter or jealous. If I'd left without documentation, it would have been my word against his, and his connections and charm might have won. If I'd opened Marino's without the comprehensive evidence proving I'd created Stella Rosa's dishes, critics might have assumed Marco's quality simply declined rather than recognizing that quality had always been mine. Instead, I'd been strategic and patient. I documented everything. I planned my departure carefully. I exposed the truth only when I had irrefutable evidence and my own platform to share it from. The completeness of my preparation made Marco's destruction inevitable once I finally acted. That's the real lesson for anyone whose creative work is being stolen. Confrontation without evidence is easily dismissed. Departure without a plan leaves you vulnerable. Exposure without documentation becomes he said she said that powerful people usually win. But comprehensive documentation plus strategic patience plus careful preparation creates conditions where truth can overcome structural power imbalances. The young chefs I mentor often want faster solutions. They want to confront credit theft immediately, expose exploitation publicly, and move on quickly to their own success. I understand the impulse because I felt it too during my years with Marco. But I also know that premature action without proper preparation can destroy the person fighting back rather than the person doing the exploiting. So I teach patience alongside documentation. I emphasize strategic thinking over emotional reaction. I stress the importance of building your case comprehensively before acting because you might only get one chance to expose the truth convincingly. And I share my own experience as proof that waiting for the right moment, while painful, can be more effective than immediate confrontation. The culinary world I work in now is different from the one I entered at 22. Not transformed completely, but shifting in ways that make exploitation slightly harder and recognition slightly more equitable. Food media asks more questions about who actually creates dishes. Culinary organizations require better attribution for awards and recognition. Young chefs are more aware of their rights and more willing to insist on proper credit. These changes are partly generational and partly the result of specific advocacy, including my own. The conversations we've had about credit theft, the examples we've publicized of chefs successfully fighting back, the structural reforms we've pushed for, all of it contributes to a culture where exploitation is less normalized and talent is more likely to be recognized accurately. But the work is far from complete. Credit theft still happens constantly. Women and marginalized people still cook brilliantly while others claim their work. Power imbalances still enable exploitation. And fighting back is still risky and difficult even with better awareness and support systems. So I continue the advocacy work alongside running my restaurants. I continue mentoring chefs facing exploitation and helping them develop strategies for documentation and strategic departure. I continue pushing food media to question narratives and verify claims rather than accepting confident assertions. I continue building systems like the incubator that support emerging talent and make it harder for exploiters to succeed. This ongoing work is my permanent revenge against Marco and everything he represented. Not just destroying his specific reputation, though that was satisfying, but undermining the structural conditions that enabled his theft and made my exploitation seem normal and acceptable for years. Every chef I help escape exploitation is another victory over the system that protected Marco. Every time food media accurately credits the person who actually created a dish instead of assuming the executive chef invented everything, that's a small defeat for the Marco Rosses of the industry. Every young chef who insists on proper credit from the beginning of their career rather than accepting invisibility is proof that patterns can change. Marco thought he could build a permanent career on my talent because the system was designed to enable exactly that kind of theft. He was right about the system. Where he was wrong was assuming I'd accept it forever. The quiet chef who'd spent 3 years being invisible decided she'd rather risk everything than continue being exploited. And that decision destroyed him while liberating me. That's what I want every chef whose work is being stolen to know. The system is rigged against you. The person stealing your work probably has more power, connections, and resources. Fighting back is risky and difficult. But documentation plus strategy plus courage can overcome structural disadvantages. Truth eventually defeats lies if you're patient and thorough enough in proving it. Marco Rossi built 3 years of reputation on stolen recipes. I destroyed that reputation in 90 days while building my own empire. The chef who'd cooked in someone else's shadow became the industry leader with multiple acclaimed restaurants and platform to advocate for systemic change. And the fraud who'd claimed credit for her work became a cautionary tale about what happens when you underestimate the person actually creating everything you claim as yours. Hit subscribe if this story inspired you to document your own work and insist on proper recognition. Share it with someone whose creative contributions are being stolen or minimized. And remember that the best revenge against exploitation is building undeniable success on your actual talent while exposing the frauds who tried to claim it. The quiet chef who'd smiled while Marco claimed her recipes as his own had the last laugh. A laugh that echoed through 3 thriving restaurants, a James Beard Award, and a permanently destroyed exploiter who'd learned too late that stealing from talented people only works until they decide to stop letting you.